Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to just apologize for my voice. I can't hear anything, so if I'm screaming at you, I apologize. I may cough, I may sneeze, I may need to blow my nose. Who knows what's going to happen in the next couple of minutes as I talk to you today about what we were supposed to talk about last week. Now, for literally all of you who are watching this video, you took your exam or are in the process of finishing up your exam, which is due Monday. So that's 2 days from now by 11:59 p.m. So you're probably still either working on that or you've already done it. If you've already done it, you will notice that your grade will come up in the next couple of days. I would say the next 48 hours or so. For those of you who have not yet finished it, don't worry. You have until all the way till midnight on Monday night, or I should say you have until 11:59 on Monday night, so before midnight on Tuesday, technically. So hopefully that worked out for all of you. I haven't heard anybody say they haven't been able to access the test since a week ago. Speaking of a week ago, when I was supposed to have your test up and we had that little kerfuffle, I worked on getting it up as fast as I could for you. And in the interim of doing that, I also found out that I had COVID. So this is my first time with COVID ever. So it's been an interesting experience for me. I've been very, very careful over the past several years being immune suppressed. All of you know I don't teach on campus. This is one of my first semesters back. And I'm only teaching one class on campus. I don't believe I got this from campus. I'm pretty sure I can isolate where I got it from. And it was me being stupid and going out somewhere unmasked when I probably should have masked. So anyway, I don't want to give it to anybody else, but more importantly, I can't risk getting worse because I do suffer from a lung disease. And so I have to make sure that it stays above my lungs and that we monitor it pretty carefully. Over the last week, I've lost my voice, and I also was asleep for the first 3 days. So I apologize for not getting this to you on the actual week, but the good news is that because you were taking your test, we only have this one small section that we're covering, which is the introduction to Christianity. Now, and I say introduction to Christianity because that's what most of the Middle Ages is going to cover. If you've read your book, it does break down the medieval period or the Middle Ages into a couple of different regions. Those that are Eastern regions, most of the Islamic religions or Hindu or other Eastern religions, their influence was not as great as we're going to find in Western culture because their cultures were not set up the same way that Western thinking was, which was that power should be decentralized, that people should have access to all of this power and information, and therefore the need for rhetoric was so great. In Eastern cultures at the time, and in some of those religions, there was no need for rhetoric because it's a very top-down approach, very centralized power. What we're going to find in the Middle Ages in the Western world is that that was true because Christianity is the same way. So just like any of the other religions, that it is top-down approach, it is incredibly centralized power. Now, what does that have to do with governments and rhetoric? Well, a lot to do with it because in the time of the Middle Ages, prior to the Renaissances, the church actually was in charge of the ruling class. Okay, so it was the ruling class, which means that and I explained this a little bit to someone recently, and maybe it was you all, I'm not sure, but where basically we get into the feudal system where we have lords who serve the bishops who serve the king and the knights. The knights serve the king, and the king, who was appointed by the Pope for the most part, making this not just Christianity ruling, but Catholicism, which that developed over, I'm acting like it happened overnight, but it happened over hundreds of years. Your book goes through a little bit of how we go through from the Holy Roman Empire, Constantine, moving into the broader, more well-known history of Catholicism and Christianity, which involves just the Pope telling people how to rule and having so much power that essentially the Pope was the king of the world as far as the Western Hemisphere was concerned. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that Eastern religions, particularly, I believe it was Muslim monks, Islamic monks, I believe it was, who preserved the texts of the ancient Greeks and Romans who wrote about rhetoric. And while the church, the Catholic Church, the Christian church was going around trying to destroy these, and we'll talk about why in a minute, they were preserving them. They were trying to save the libraries. They were trying to save any works that they could from the classics because they understood how important that history was. So that was sort of a battle of culture at the time as well that sort of underscores all the way through the medieval period, including through the Crusades. So any history you know about any of those things will help you a little bit in understanding how rhetoric was basically attempted to be stomped out during this period. And as I've said before, it's a long period of time. Some people say, well, it started in about the 800s and ran until about, 1600. Others say that it ran from 1200 to 1600. I mean, a lot of historians have different views on what we consider to be the medieval period, the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, whatever way you want to term it. But we know this, it lasted in excess of 400 years. Probably closer to 800 years, which is a third of the entirety of time that you and I are planning to study by the end of the semester. So that's a big chunk. It's important for us to keep that in mind, that a third of the time that we're planning to study was literally a time when rhetoric could not be practiced and could not flourish. Let's talk about why now. There's a lot of problems with rhetoric going into the medieval period. With the birth of Christianity, people started to talk about the ethics and morals of rhetoric, but not in the same way that they were talking about it from Cicero, Quintilian, and others, Aristotle. When we were talking about the ethics of it, they were talking about the moral proposition of practicing rhetoric. And rhetoric was a lot of things. It came from the ancient Greeks and Romans, which means that it was a pagan practice, apparently. I'm not really sure how rhetoric is a religious practice, but that was the assignment, was that essentially it was utilized by pagans, therefore it was a pagan practice. All right, that was problematic. That one of my favorite things that they say about it is that it was salacious, is how your book currently puts it. The way that Augustine puts it in his Confessions is that it aroused the passions. In other words, it's incredibly seductive, and Aristotle said the same thing, as did Plato. It's incredibly seductive to exert power over people by using language. So the Catholic Church didn't like that very much. It felt that arousing the passions was bad. Another reason why it was considered bad, and I don't think they mention this in the book, this edit, but just so you know, is that the first entity to practice rhetoric in a strict biblical interpretation of the world would actually be Satan. So it does not matter where you think Satan came from, whether he is an entity that is, established in contrary to Jesus Christ, whether you believe that it's Lucifer, an angel who fell because God banished him to a place called hell. Whatever the origin story is for the devil or Satan or Lucifer, let's just put them all together, if you don't mind, for the purpose of this class. That is to say, the source of evil. Turns himself into a snake, right, in the biblical story of Adam and Eve, turns himself into a snake, and then proceeds to convince Eve. He seduces Eve into eating from the tree of knowledge, which today we call an apple tree, but was actually a quince, which is a different fruit. So I don't know why that's important. It's probably not. But and Eve, of course, as we know, tastes the fruit of knowledge, goes to Adam and says, you have to do this now too, and basically convinces him to do the same. So the first thing that rhetoric is used for in the Bible, according to this interpretation, would be for evil. Now, we can argue about that all we want. If you want to have a religious and inspired discussion about that, feel free to let me know off of class time. But for right now, what the accusation was that rhetoric was pagan and that it was used for evil. So that's the third problem that they really had with rhetoric. The fourth problem that they had with rhetoric is that it was an exercise in pride. Okay, now if you're familiar at all with the idea of the 7 deadly sins or the things that send you to hell in Christianity, the number one sin is pride. That is to think that you are bigger and better than God, in however you define that. That is considered the biggest sin. Okay, again, this is a very specific religious belief. That's what they had. And so people would say that the practice of rhetoric made you feel powerful. It gave you some sort of power. It made you feel good. And therefore, you were actually practicing in a sin of pride. And that was bad because it was temptation. Okay. Finally, and this is probably the most important criticism that they have because it matches the criticism of Plato in a lot of ways, which is that rhetoric can make you pull away from belief in God, that God is truth. The Bible, therefore, is truth. Only the teachings of the church are truth. And if you listen to anything else, that is considered to be a lie. So this whole thing of Cicero saying you need to know everything that you can about your subject and saying that you need to learn a rhetoric from the beginning, and Quintilian saying a perfect orator knows the entirety of his subject matter, pardon the sexualized language there, sexist language, excuse me, that Plato said the same thing. This idea that you can't know everything. And if you're not using the Bible or speaking from God, then you are not preaching the truth. And therefore, that's bad. Okay, hopefully you followed all that. So they believed that those were the 5 reasons why rhetoric was bad. That is the attitude going into the Middle Ages, somewhere around the mid-400s, okay, AD. So what we're looking at is a world in the Western Hemisphere specifically that is ruled by a church, a religious entity, and where the truth can only come from that church and from that God. And rhetoric is a distraction from all of that, and it's used to seduce people over to evil. That's important for you to understand when we talk about what happened to rhetoric in the medieval period. We are actually finding more and more evidence of people who wrote or taught about rhetoric during this time period. We just didn't have access to some of this material. When I was your age, we learned that there was only one person who taught rhetoric during the medieval period, and that was St. Augustine, and that was it. Now, you've learned already in your book that there's at least a few others who have preserved rhetoric and written about rhetoric and possibly were teaching rhetoric during the medieval period. We also know that the sophists were still practicing because we still had lawyers and we still had teachers. So we obviously still had sophists practicing, quote, rhetoric. And I'm sorry to Isocrates for saying that sophists practiced rhetoric, but it's all we got, right? You've already learned that there's more than that going on. Christine de Pizan is going to be one of them. Margaret Fell later on during the early parts of the Renaissance is going to be another. And we'll touch briefly on them. But next week, I'm going to focus solely on Augustine. So I don't want to get too deep into the weeds with him right this second, but I do want to make sure that you're prepared for talking about what rhetoric could and could not do during the Middle Ages. So that's the stage that is set for us. Now, if we have a very centralized power, in this case, the church, where the truth only comes from that power, what need could there possibly be for rhetoric? There wouldn't be one. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to this, but the biggest one that you're going to learn about next week through St. Augustine is going to be that preachers needed to understand rhetoric. And we'll talk about why when we get there, but you could start to sort of imagine why. I mean, your book already told you in the introduction that you read this past week, they say that it was used to teach preachers how to practice hermeneutics, which is interpretation, a revisitation of the Bible in terms of the modern time period. So, when people say, well, the Bible says this, that's it, there's strict interpretation only, that's the story, that's the end of it, this is the rule. Whereas others might say, well, in light of the context in which it occurred, this is what the lesson is that we're supposed to get. That's called homiletics, really, more than anything else. Hermeneutics would be, here's the culture we're in now, here's the time period we're in now, here are the things that are important now, and this is how the Bible should be interpreted for right now. That would be hermeneutics. So we have these processes, or these types of preaching, if you will, that people used rhetoric for. And there was a great deal of writing about that. I'm not going to make you read it because, wow, that's really boring. Trust me on that one. If you want to flip through the pieces from Augustine that you have in your book, that's not a terrible read. It's a little bit wordy, I'm not going to lie, but if it's something that you're interested in, feel free to take a gander at it. For our part, I'm just going to summarize it for you next week. In class or on a video, so you don't have to read it. But if you could read the introductions as I've assigned, that will be super helpful for you for next week. I don't believe I assigned reading any Augustine. I'm going to try to see without my glasses for a moment, which is not my smartest move. But again, sorry, brain fog from medication and illness here. Let me see if I can find. All right, here's your syllabus. Oh, I do have you reading some Augustine. Well, I have you reading 7 pages of Augustine. I think that's the introduction to Augustine. So there you have that. So hopefully it won't be too bad for you. But I'll be summarizing his works, which are a lot bigger than 7 pages, I promise, a lot longer. What else is going on during the medieval period that's important for you to know? We know that the feudal system was in place. We know that there was not a whole lot of movement from one class to another. You were born into a class, and that was that. We know that there weren't females speaking in public or writing great works. Okay, so that's all stuff we knew up until about the mid 2000s, really. It's really until about 2000 2010, where we started to unearth a lot more that we could interpret as practices of rhetoric. We will see women who did work, and a lot of it is considered rhetorical in nature, the practice of rhetoric, the practice of public speaking. We also start to see a development of style, particularly for pastors and monks, but that develops out into the what do we want to call it, secular society. Not too quickly. It takes hundreds of years, but it happens. And you might wonder, why couldn't women speak other than that age-old idea that women weren't allowed to do so? Well, there were a lot of reasons why women were told they shouldn't speak in public. The biggest one was that people felt that exposing yourself in public by speaking in public was a dirty practice. So public speakers were not necessarily the highest level of character, okay? And they were considered to have scrupulous, sort of maybe unscrupulous morals and questionable ethics. And so nobody wanted women to have to take that on. Women already were seen as pretty weak and as having a job in the household to take care of children, to cook, to clean, etc. They didn't labor in the fields. They had sons to do that. They had husbands to do that. And so women weren't really speaking anywhere. We also know that during this time period, people weren't traveling, right? Unless you were traveling because you were a knight or you were part of the court. or you were a courtier, or a prince or princess or queen or king, you did not travel. So you stayed on your land, or your lord's land, I should say, and you tilled that soil that you were supposed to farm for generations. So you just had this small fief on the land that you actually worked with, and that was it. I always picture the medieval period as people with their heads down, right? That they're not looking at anything beyond what they're working on in that moment. They may have never left the Lord's land, like not to go to town or market even, okay? And so if some of you are thinking, well, what about some of these movies I've seen where they show minstrels traveling and they show, during medieval times, people gathering in the streets and things like that. That really didn't start to happen until later on when we start moving into the Renaissances, because that sharing and spread of knowledge was considered bad. So we're going to see some rhetoricians come up and disrupt this system, in case you're curious. That's going to come later. For right now, though, rhetoric was used for only the following things. One, educating the kings and queens' children, so the princes and princesses, and the courtiers in some cases, only for preaching, and only to maintain the rules and laws and regulations of the kingdom. And that was it. That was pretty much all of it. Then you had sophists who, if they had to deal with the courts, could potentially speak on your behalf, but they would have to be pretty way up in the class system for that to happen. So the more power you had, translation, the richer you were, the more you were allowed to speak. So no women and very few people. And we can see this play out in some of the historical movies that we see as well. I always say a movie during the Dark Ages, during the Dark Ages. Wow. A movie about the Dark Ages or about the medieval period would be incredibly boring. There couldn't be a lot of talking. There couldn't be a lot of sharing. There wouldn't be any learning going on. Excuse me. Because if you're not allowed to get knowledge from anywhere else, and you're not really traveling or communicating, what do you have to learn? And how do we teach others things? How do we find out new things? How do we progress in finding out new truths or learning new things if we're not traveling, if we're not sharing, if we're not trying to share ideas beyond the scope of the Bible and the Pope, right? That becomes very difficult. So, yes, are we going to cover about 800 years in about, a day and a half? Yes, we will. But it's probably necessary, and it's very difficult to spend much longer than that on it. I will introduce you next week, not just to Augustine, but to a few others. But for today, I just want you to understand what the world was like heading into the medieval period for rhetoric. I want you to know the 5 reasons why rhetoric was considered to be evil or bad or shouldn't be practiced during the medieval period. I want you to know what happened during those dark ages that made it difficult for us to progress or to learn. And I want you to understand sort of not necessarily the social class structure or economic structure, but some structure of society where the hierarchy was that the church was at the top. All truth and knowledge came from the truth, or from the church, and therefore everything down below that could not be new. It could just be a reiteration of what the church tells us that we should know. So hopefully that sums it up. I know that this video is rather quick. I thank you for letting me cut off a little early. My throat is getting scratchy, as you're hearing. And we will be in touch again next week. Keep reading, finish your exams. I'll continue to grade them. And I will talk to you all on the other side of the weekend.